Rain has a way of making lonely places feel even lonelier. On one cold afternoon, as water streamed down the glass shelters of a quiet American bus stop, an 11-year-old girl sat completely still, clutching the only possessions she had left in the world. They weren't packed inside a colorful backpack or a worn-out suitcase. They were crammed into a black garbage bag that sagged beside her feet, soaked by the rain as if no one had ever expected it to matter. Hundreds of people drove past without slowing down. Expensive SUVs sprayed water across the sidewalk. Delivery trucks rushed to their next stop. Commuters stared straight ahead. To everyone else, she was simply another child waiting for another ride. Then a black Rolls-Royce eased to the curb. The man who stepped out was worth billions of dollars, owned companies across the country, and rarely stopped for anyone. Yet the instant his eyes landed on that garbage bag, every step forward came to a halt. His shoulders stiffened. His breathing changed. His hands began to tremble. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. After several long seconds, he whispered words that no one standing nearby could possibly understand. They still haven't stopped doing this. Those 7 words carried the weight of a lifetime. And although the little girl had never seen him before, they connected 2 strangers through a painful memory neither of them had chosen. In that single moment, a successful businessman named Fred Wood was no longer looking at an 11-year-old foster child waiting for another placement. He was staring directly into his own childhood, into a memory he had buried beneath decades of hard work, unimaginable success, and carefully constructed distance from the life he once knew. At first glance, this might seem like the story of a billionaire rescuing a little girl, but that isn't what happened at all. The truth is far more emotional than that, because over the next 12 months, this unexpected meeting would force Fred to confront memories he had spent more than 30 years trying to silence. It would reveal a heartbreaking reality that thousands of foster children across America continue to experience every single day, and it would inspire an act of compassion that reached far beyond one child named Christy. Courtrooms would become witnesses to impossible decisions. Social workers would see something they almost never expected. A quiet little girl who had learned never to unpack her belongings would slowly begin believing that she might finally have a place to call home. Hundreds of suitcases would eventually replace thousands of garbage bags, carrying with them a message that no child should ever have to question their worth. But none of that was supposed to happen. Marcus Hale had built his fortune by looking forward, never backward. He believed he had escaped every painful chapter of his childhood, convincing himself that success had closed the door on the little boy he used to be. He had no intention of reopening those memories. He certainly never imagined that everything he had spent decades avoiding would return on an ordinary rainy afternoon, waiting quietly beneath a bus shelter with a garbage bag resting beside a pair of worn sneakers. So what was it about that garbage bag that reduced a billionaire to silence? Why did one ordinary encounter change the direction of 2 completely different lives? And how did one forgotten child become the reason an entire nation began asking whether the foster care system had overlooked something painfully simple for generations? To answer those questions, we have to begin long before Fred became one of America's wealthiest businessmen, back when he was just another frightened little boy who discovered far too early that sometimes the hardest part of losing a home isn't walking out the front door. It's realizing that everything you own can be carried away in a bag meant for the trash. The image of that rainy afternoon raises far more questions than answers. Why would a man who had spent decades building one of the largest business empires in America suddenly stop everything because of an ordinary black garbage bag? Why would someone who negotiated billion-dollar deals without showing the slightest emotion suddenly find himself unable to take another step? And who was the quiet little girl sitting beneath that bus shelter? Her name was Christy. She was only 11 years old, and like thousands of children across the United States, she was waiting for a ride that would take her somewhere unfamiliar once again. She wasn't waiting for a vacation or a visit with relatives. She was waiting to be taken to another foster home, another bedroom that didn't feel like hers, Another set of strangers she would be expected to call family until someone decided it was time for her to leave again. The garbage bag resting beside her wasn't an accident or a temporary solution. It had become the suitcase she never asked for, carrying every piece of clothing, every photograph, every keepsake, and every memory that could fit inside a bag designed to hold things people throw away. To most people driving past that afternoon, it looked ordinary because they had never stopped to ask why so many children in foster care leave one home carrying their entire lives this way. Fred noticed immediately because he had once carried his own childhood in exactly the same kind of bag, and memories he believed had disappeared forever suddenly returned with astonishing clarity. The questions only become more difficult from here. Why would one of America's wealthiest men, someone approaching 50 years old with unlimited resources and every comfort money could buy, decide to enter a foster care system known for complicated legal requirements, emotional uncertainty, and endless waiting? He could have written a check to any charity in the country. He could have funded scholarships, built shelters, or donated millions without ever changing his own daily routine. Instead, something about Christy's quiet presence forced him toward a decision that would demand far more than money. It would require patience, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront the parts of his own life he had spent decades trying to forget. Friends would question his judgment. Business associates would wonder if emotion had clouded his thinking. Even people closest to him would struggle to understand why one brief encounter at a bus stop had affected him so deeply. Yet Fred wasn't reacting to what he saw in front of him alone. He was responding to memories that had never truly left him. Memories hidden beneath years of achievement, polished boardrooms, and headlines celebrating the billionaire who appeared to have everything. The truth was that success had changed almost every part of his life except the frightened little boy who still existed somewhere beneath the surface, waiting for someone to acknowledge what had happened to him all those years ago. Then there was Christy herself. Who was she before that rainy afternoon? And what had happened during the first 11 years of her life that left her sitting alone beside a garbage bag while the rest of the world hurried past without noticing? Every child enters foster care with a different story, but they often carry the same silent hope that maybe the next home will finally become the last one. Christy had learned not to expect promises because promises had a way of disappearing. She had learned not to unpack too quickly because experience had taught her that staying rarely lasted. She had learned to smile politely, follow instructions, and avoid asking difficult questions because she believed that being easy to care for might somehow convince someone to let her stay. What she didn't know was that, on this particular afternoon, someone was looking at her with eyes that understood every fear she had never spoken aloud. Fred recognized something in Christy that no financial report, board meeting, or business success had ever prepared him to face. He recognized himself. And to understand why that realization shook him so completely, we have to leave the rain-soaked bus stop behind and travel back nearly 40 years to a frightened little boy whose future seemed every bit as uncertain as Christy's. To understand why Fred stood frozen beside that rainy bus stop, unable to take another step after seeing Christy's garbage bag, we have to return to a version of him that no magazine ever featured and no business biography ever celebrated. Long before private jets, corporate boardrooms, and headlines calling him one of America's most successful entrepreneurs, Fred was simply an 8-year-old boy sitting on the edge of a worn-out sofa, listening to adults speak about his future as though he wasn't even in the room. He didn't fully understand why everything was changing so quickly. He only knew that his home no longer felt safe. The voices around him had become louder than the laughter he barely remembered. And one afternoon, a social worker gently knelt beside him and explained that he would be leaving for a while. Children often believe adults when they're told difficult things are temporary. Fred believed it too. He thought he would return home within days. Instead, days became weeks, weeks became months, and before long, the idea of going home slowly disappeared until it became something he could no longer picture. The first foster family tried their best, but they were only one stop on a journey that seemed to have no destination. Before he had memorized the neighborhood streets, he was told it was time to move again. Another family. Another bedroom. Another school. Another set of strangers learning his name, while he quietly wondered how long it would be before he had to say goodbye all over again. As the years passed, the pattern repeated itself with exhausting consistency. Every new house came with the same instructions, the same cautious smiles, and the same uncertainty. Fred stopped asking where he would be living next month, because the answer rarely stayed the same for long. He learned not to decorate bedroom walls, because taking pictures down hurt more than leaving them blank. He stopped arranging books neatly on shelves, because they would soon be packed away again. Birthdays came and went in unfamiliar kitchens. Christmas mornings were celebrated with families that often meant well, but couldn't promise permanence. Every move taught him another painful lesson about protecting his heart. He convinced himself that caring less would make leaving easier, even though it never did. With every goodbye, another piece of childhood slipped away until survival became more important than dreaming. He watched other children invite classmates home after school, while he carefully avoided explaining where he lived because he wasn't sure the answer would still be true by the following week. Stability became something he observed from a distance rather than something he experienced for himself. And although he was too young to describe what he was feeling, loneliness quietly became his most familiar companion. There was one memory, however, that never loosened its grip on him. Every time he was transferred from one foster home to another, someone handed him a large black garbage bag. That bag held everything he owned. A few shirts, a pair of shoes, school papers, family photographs he refused to throw away even after they faded with time. The adults saw a practical solution for transporting belongings, but Fred saw something entirely different. To an 8-year-old boy already struggling to understand his place in the world, it felt as though his life had been packed away like something disposable. Years later, he would struggle to explain why that simple object carried so much emotional weight, yet every foster child who experienced it understood immediately. It wasn't the plastic itself that hurt. It was what the plastic seemed to say without using words. You don't have enough to deserve a suitcase. You won't be here long enough to unpack. Don't get comfortable. Don't expect this place to become home. Those silent messages settled deep inside him long before he had the vocabulary to challenge them. One afternoon, while waiting for another placement, Fred sat beside an older foster boy who couldn't have been more than 13. The boy watched Fred carefully fold each shirt before placing it inside another black garbage bag. After several moments of silence, he gave a sad smile and quietly said something Fred would remember for the rest of his life. "Don't bother folding your clothes. You'll move again soon." The words weren't spoken with cruelty. They were spoken with experience. That sentence captured everything the foster system had taught two children before either of them was old enough to understand how deeply those lessons would shape the rest of their lives. Fred slowly unfolded the shirts he had spent so much time arranging, realizing that the older boy wasn't trying to be unkind. He was preparing him for disappointment because disappointment had become normal. From that day forward, Fred stopped unpacking completely. Even when foster parents encouraged him to hang his clothes in the closet or place his toys on shelves, he kept most of his belongings inside the same bag. Somewhere inside his young mind, he believed leaving would hurt less if he never fully settled in. He became an expert at arriving without belonging, smiling without trusting, and thanking people without believing he would still be there a month later. Those experiences shaped the man Fred would eventually become in ways even he failed to recognize for many years. As he grew older, he made a quiet promise to himself that no one else ever heard. He would never again allow another person or another circumstance to decide where his life was headed. If instability had defined his childhood, then control would define his future. He threw himself into school with relentless determination, worked jobs most teenagers avoided, and refused to let rejection become permanent. Every obstacle became another reason to work harder. Every closed door became another challenge to overcome. Success wasn't simply about becoming wealthy. For Fred, success represented safety. Money meant choices. Businesses meant independence. Ownership meant no one could suddenly tell him to pack his belongings and leave again. Decades of discipline transformed a frightened foster child into one of America's most respected entrepreneurs. Company after company flourished under his leadership. Investments multiplied. His name appeared on magazine covers. Financial networks analyzed his business decisions. Politicians sought his advice. Before long, Fred possessed everything he had once believed would finally silence the painful memories of childhood. He owned beautiful homes, luxury cars, private aircraft, and more wealth than he could spend in several lifetimes. Yet every achievement only covered the wound instead of healing it. The frightened little boy carrying his life inside a garbage bag never truly disappeared. He simply learned to hide beneath tailored suits, confident speeches, and billion-dollar success. For years, Fred convinced himself that the past belonged exactly where it was, in the past. He rarely spoke about foster care. Few people in his professional circle even knew he had grown up moving from one home to another. It became the chapter of his life he quietly edited out whenever someone asked about his childhood. He believed distance was the same as healing. He believed enough years and enough accomplishments could erase memories that once kept him awake at night. Then came the rainy afternoon when a black Rolls-Royce stopped beside a lonely bus shelter, and an 11-year-old girl named Christy sat waiting beside a black garbage bag. In a single heartbeat, every wall Fred had spent decades building around those memories collapsed. The boardrooms disappeared. The billion-dollar companies disappeared. The successful businessman disappeared. Standing there in the rain wasn't the billionaire the world admired. It was the frightened 8-year-old boy who suddenly remembered exactly how it felt to believe your entire life could fit inside a bag meant for the trash. Fred believed he had escaped his past, until one rainy afternoon, his childhood came back carrying a garbage bag. Now, for a moment, leave Fred standing beside that rain-soaked bus stop and step into the world as Christy knew it. She was only 11 years old, but her eyes carried the quiet caution of someone who had already learned lessons many adults spend a lifetime trying to understand. She wasn't loud or demanding. She didn't interrupt conversations or ask for expensive things. Most people who met her for the first time described her the same way. Polite, respectful, easygoing. The kind of child who never seemed to cause trouble. At first, those descriptions sounded like compliments, but the people who knew the foster care system understood something different. Children like Christy often become quiet because experience teaches them that drawing attention can sometimes make life harder. They become careful with their words because they never know which sentence might upset someone. They learn to observe every expression on an adult's face, trying to determine whether today will be a good day or another day filled with disappointment. Christy had become remarkably good at reading rooms before she had even entered middle school. She knew when to stay silent, when to smile politely, and when to disappear into a corner with a book so she wouldn't become a burden. None of those habits came naturally. They were survival skills developed one placement at a time, one goodbye after another, until they became part of who she was. By the time Fred saw her sitting beneath that bus shelter, Christy had already lived in more homes than many adults would occupy in an entire lifetime. Some foster parents genuinely cared for her, but could only provide temporary care. Others faced circumstances that made continuing impossible. A few homes simply weren't the safe places every child deserves. With each move came another new school, another unfamiliar neighborhood, another bedroom where she cautiously placed her few belongings while quietly wondering how long she would be allowed to stay this time. She stopped memorizing street names because she rarely remained long enough to need them. She stopped making close friends because saying goodbye hurt more every time. Birthday invitations became difficult to accept when she couldn't be certain where she would be living the following month. Teachers came and went. Neighbors changed. Family photographs hanging on other people's walls reminded her of something she couldn't remember having for herself. Every placement began with hopeful introductions and ended with another ride to somewhere unfamiliar. Nobody intended for her childhood to become a series of temporary addresses, yet temporary became the only thing that ever seemed permanent. There was a routine to every move, and Christy could almost predict each step before it happened. A social worker would arrive with a gentle voice and an apologetic smile. She would be told it was time to gather her things. Someone would hand her another large black garbage bag because there wasn't always a suitcase available. She would carefully place her clothes inside, followed by a stuffed animal that had somehow survived every transfer, a few school papers she couldn't bear to leave behind, and a small notebook she protected more carefully than anything else she owned. Then came the drive. Sometimes it was across town, sometimes to another county, sometimes far enough away that everything familiar disappeared through the car window. She learned to watch neighborhoods pass by without asking questions because the answers rarely brought comfort. New streets replaced old ones. New houses replaced familiar ones. Eventually, the vehicle would stop, another front door would open, another introduction would begin, and another chapter would start before the last one had ever truly ended. It happened so many times that packing no longer felt unusual. It became part of childhood itself. For Christy, life moved in a heartbreaking rhythm. Garbage bag, bus ride, new strangers, repeat. The cycle continued until she could hardly remember what it felt like to believe she might stay anywhere forever. Despite everything she had experienced, Christy refused to let bitterness define her. She still thanked every foster parent who welcomed her through their door. She still helped wash dishes after dinner without being asked. She still completed her homework, smiled at classmates, and tried her best to make every new house feel like a place she belonged, even when part of her already expected another goodbye. But there was one habit she never shared with anyone. Hidden inside the small notebook she carried from home to home were names written carefully in neat handwriting. Every foster family she had ever lived with had a page. She remembered their last names, the towns where they lived, favorite meals they cooked, birthdays she celebrated with them, pets she had loved, and little moments that made each house feel less unfamiliar. Some entries were only a few lines long because she hadn't stayed very long. Others filled entire pages with memories she hoped would never disappear. At the very end of every entry, she quietly wrote the same sentence. Maybe this one will be forever. Then, after another move, she would turn the page and begin again with another family's name. She never crossed out the old entries because she wanted to believe they still mattered. She wasn't collecting addresses. She was collecting pieces of a childhood she feared would otherwise vanish. No one knew about that notebook. Not the social workers. Not the foster parents. Not her teachers. It became the one place where Christy allowed herself to dream about something she rarely spoke aloud. She imagined the day she would reach the final page and never have to write another new name again, because someone would finally tell her she belonged. Someone would tell her she wasn't leaving next week, next month, or next year. Someone would call her daughter without adding the word foster before it. Every night before falling asleep, she wondered what that would feel like. Would it feel different waking up in a home that was truly hers? Would she finally unpack every piece of clothing instead of leaving half of it inside the garbage bag? Would she stop looking out the bedroom window whenever a strange car pulled into the driveway, wondering if another move had arrived? Eventually, those questions became too painful to ask. Hope, after enough disappointments, begins to feel dangerous. Little by little, Christy protected herself the only way she knew how. She lowered her expectations until they almost disappeared. She smiled because people expected her to smile. She thanked adults because kindness cost nothing. But inside, she slowly stopped believing that forever was something meant for children like her. By the time Fred's Rolls-Royce pulled to the curb that rainy afternoon, Christy had already given up asking the question that most children ask without even thinking. She no longer looked at new houses and wondered if she would grow up there. She no longer imagined decorating the same bedroom year after year. She no longer pictured family photographs that included her every Christmas. She had already stopped asking herself one simple question because experience had convinced her the answer would always be the same. That question was, is anyone ever going to choose me and let me stay? She didn't know it yet, but the man standing a few feet away, staring silently at the garbage bag beside her, was asking himself a question that would change both of their lives forever. The rain continued to fall with the same steady rhythm, as if the world had no idea that two lives were about to change forever. Cars moved through the intersection without hesitation. People hurried beneath umbrellas. focused on getting home before the weather became worse. The bus shelter remained almost invisible to everyone except the man who had just stepped out of a black Rolls-Royce. Fred stood perfectly still, unable to take his eyes off the black garbage bag resting beside Christy. It wasn't an expensive watch, a business opportunity, or a headline that had captured his attention. It was a simple plastic bag, the kind millions of people throw away without giving it a second thought. Yet to Fred, it carried a meaning no amount of wealth could erase. For a few long seconds, the successful businessman disappeared completely. His surroundings faded into silence as memories he had spent decades burying forced their way back into his mind with startling clarity. He remembered another rainy afternoon, another curb, another social worker, another frightened little boy watching strangers load everything he owned into a garbage bag because no one had thought to bring a suitcase. He remembered gripping the top of the plastic so tightly that his fingers hurt, terrified that if it tore open, the few belongings he still had would scatter across the sidewalk. He remembered looking through the windows of passing cars, wondering if anyone noticed the child carrying his entire life in something meant for trash. Most never looked. Those who did quickly looked away. Standing there beside Christy, Fred realized he had never truly forgotten that feeling. He had simply become very good at pretending it no longer existed. For years, success had convinced him that he had escaped the frightened boy he once was. He had surrounded himself with polished offices, carefully planned schedules, and achievements that made people admire his determination. Yet none of those accomplishments prepared him for the overwhelming flood of emotion that arrived the instant he saw Christy's garbage bag. He remembered each foster home as though the years between had disappeared. He remembered lying awake in unfamiliar bedrooms, wondering how long he would stay before another move. He remembered refusing to unpack because someone had once told him there was no point. He remembered trying not to become attached to people who might disappear from his life without warning. Every memory returned at once, and for the first time in decades, Fred understood that the little boy inside him had never stopped waiting for someone to notice what he had carried all those years ago. The rain falling around him seemed to blur the line between past and present until it became impossible to tell whether he was looking at Christy or looking at himself. The pain was the same. The uncertainty was the same. Even the garbage bag looked exactly the way he remembered it. Christy noticed him standing there before he spoke. She looked up cautiously, uncertain why someone dressed in an expensive overcoat had stopped in front of the bus shelter. She had grown accustomed to adults passing by without saying anything, so she quietly lowered her eyes again, assuming he would continue walking after a moment. Instead, Fred slowly stepped closer and lowered himself until he was kneeling beside her. He didn't begin with questions about her past. He didn't tell her he understood exactly how she felt, because he knew those words would sound impossible coming from someone who appeared to have everything. He simply offered a warm smile, one that carried neither pity nor curiosity. "Hi," he said gently. "I'm Fred." Christy answered almost in a whisper. "I'm Christy." There was an awkward silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that sometimes exists between two people who have experienced the same kind of loneliness without realizing it. Fred glanced toward the garbage bag before looking back at her. "Have you been waiting long?" he asked softly. Christy shrugged. "A little while." She answered with the calm acceptance of someone who had learned that waiting was simply another part of life. Fred nodded slowly. Waiting can feel like a very long time. Christy looked at him for a moment, surprised that he seemed to understand something she had never said aloud. Their conversation remained simple, almost ordinary, yet every sentence carried a quiet weight. Fred asked whether she liked school. She told him reading was her favorite subject because books stayed the same even when everything else changed. He asked whether she liked drawing, and she admitted she loved sketching houses with large front porches, although she laughed softly and confessed she had never actually lived in one. Fred smiled, but his heart grew heavier with every answer. There was no anger in Christy's voice, no resentment, only the quiet acceptance of a child who had become accustomed to beginning again. She never complained about moving. She never criticized the adults who had come and gone from her life. She spoke with remarkable kindness, almost as though she worried that saying the wrong thing might disappoint someone. Fred recognized that habit immediately because he had once spoken the very same way. Children who fear being left behind often become experts at making themselves easy to love, hoping that kindness alone might persuade someone not to leave them. Listening to Christy felt like listening to echoes from his own childhood, and every word deepened his conviction that no child should ever have to carry such burdens alone. A few steps away, the social worker waited patiently, giving them space while keeping a watchful eye on the time. Eventually, Fred rose to his feet and walked toward her. His expression had changed completely. The uncertainty he carried when he stepped out of the Rolls-Royce had given way to something quieter, something far more determined. He hesitated for only a moment before asking the question that had formed in his mind almost the instant he saw Christy sitting beneath that shelter. "Is anyone waiting for her?" The social worker didn't answer immediately. She lowered her eyes, glanced briefly toward Christy, and released a slow breath that seemed to carry years of exhaustion. The silence lasted only a few seconds, yet to Fred it felt endless. Finally, she looked back at him and answered with a single word. "No." There was no anger in her voice, only sadness. She had delivered that answer too many times before. It wasn't simply a response to Fred's question. It was the heartbreaking reality facing countless children who spent years hoping someone would choose them permanently. Christy wasn't on her way to a forever home. She was on her way to another temporary address, another unfamiliar bedroom, another chapter with an ending already expected before it had even begun. Fred turned back toward the bus shelter and watched Christy sitting quietly beside the same garbage bag that had reopened every wound he believed had healed long ago. In that moment, he understood something that no business success had ever taught him. Some opportunities arrive only once, and they cannot be measured in dollars, percentages, or profits. They arrive disguised as ordinary moments, asking only whether someone is willing to act. The answer he had just heard would stay with him long after the rain stopped falling. It would follow him into every meeting, every quiet evening, and every sleepless night until ignoring it became impossible. He had asked whether anyone was waiting for Christy. The answer was no. But another question had already begun forming deep inside him, one he wasn't yet ready to say aloud. If no one was waiting for her, could he become the person who finally would? That single answer would completely change Fred's life. From that moment forward, he would discover that becoming a family required far more than compassion. It demanded courage, patience, sacrifice, and a willingness to confront the past he had spent decades trying to leave behind. Fred drove away from the bus stop that afternoon, but the image of Christy sitting beside that black garbage bag refused to leave him. He tried returning to the schedule that had defined his life for years. Meetings filled his calendar. Investors expected updates. Executives waited for decisions that affected thousands of employees. On paper, everything looked exactly as it had the day before. Yet something had shifted in a way he couldn't explain. During presentations, he found his thoughts drifting back to the bus shelter. While reviewing financial reports, he caught himself wondering where Christy would sleep that night. At dinner, expensive meals sat untouched because he couldn't stop thinking about an 11-year-old girl who had learned to fit her entire life inside a garbage bag. He had spent decades believing that wealth solved problems. Now he was beginning to understand that some of the deepest wounds in America had very little to do with money and everything to do with belonging. Instead of searching for distractions, Fred did something he had avoided for most of his adult life. He began researching the foster care system he had escaped years earlier. Night after night, he read reports, listened to former foster youth describe their experiences, studied the legal process, and spoke privately with social workers who dedicated their lives to children most people never noticed. Every conversation left him with the same unsettling realization. The system was filled with compassionate people working tirelessly under enormous pressure. Yet too many children still spent years moving from one temporary home to another without ever experiencing the stability every child deserves. The statistics were difficult enough to absorb, but the personal stories affected him far more. Children described carrying their belongings in garbage bags because proper luggage wasn't always available. They spoke about changing schools repeatedly, losing friendships, and celebrating birthdays with families they barely knew. None of it sounded unfamiliar. It sounded like his own childhood. The more Fred learned, the more impossible it became to pretend that meeting Christy had been a coincidence meant to fade with time. He discovered that becoming a foster parent wasn't a decision someone could make on emotion alone. It involved careful evaluation, extensive preparation, and months of waiting designed to protect children who had already experienced more instability than anyone should. The process was intentionally thorough, and Fred respected that. Even so, he quickly realized there would be no shortcuts simply because he happened to be wealthy. In fact, his financial success often created additional questions. Social workers wanted to understand his motivations. Attorneys explained that every step would be carefully documented. Child welfare professionals needed reassurance that this wasn't an impulsive act inspired by guilt or publicity. Fred welcomed those questions because, for the first time in years, he found himself asking the same questions of himself. Was he trying to rescue Christy, or was he trying to heal the frightened child he used to be? Could he truly provide the consistency she needed, or was he chasing an emotional moment that would eventually fade? Those were difficult questions, and he refused to answer them carelessly. Instead, he continued learning, listening, and reflecting until he understood that fostering a child wasn't about changing one afternoon. It was about changing every ordinary day that followed. Not everyone around Fred understood why he had become so determined. His legal team urged caution, reminding him that adopting or fostering as a high-profile public figure would attract enormous attention. They warned him that every decision could be examined by the media, questioned by critics, and interpreted in ways he couldn't control. Members of his company's board worried that a deeply personal decision might become a public distraction capable of affecting the business. Some investors quietly wondered whether he was allowing emotion to influence his judgment. Friends who had known him for years struggled to recognize the man sitting across from them. They reminded him of the demanding schedule he already maintained and questioned whether raising a child at nearly 50 years old made practical sense. A few suggested making a charitable donation instead. They argued that funding foster care organizations could help thousands of children without requiring such a dramatic change to his own life. Fred listened respectfully because he understood their concerns. On the surface, their advice sounded logical. But logic wasn't what had brought him to that rainy bus stop. Logic had never looked into the eyes of a child who had already stopped believing someone might choose her forever. Before long, word began circulating that the billionaire businessman had taken an unusual interest in foster care. Speculation spread quickly. Commentators questioned whether the story would become a carefully managed public relations campaign. Some insisted there had to be another motive. Others suggested he was searching for positive headlines after years of keeping his personal life almost entirely private. Social media filled with opinions from people who knew almost nothing about him. Some praised him before anything had happened. Others criticized him for reasons they invented themselves. Fred read very little of it. He had spent enough of his life allowing public expectations to influence private decisions. This time was different. This decision belonged neither to shareholders nor to journalists. It belonged to a little girl named Christy who still had no permanent home, and to the little boy he once was, who had spent years wishing someone would simply stay. For perhaps the first time since building his fortune, Fred understood that doing the right thing often meant accepting that not everyone would understand why you were doing it. So he continued forward, one requirement at a time. He attended foster parent training sessions alongside people from every imaginable background, never asking for special treatment and never receiving any. He completed detailed background investigations that examined every aspect of his life. Financial records, employment history, personal references, and legal documents were reviewed with remarkable care. Professionals visited his home repeatedly, inspecting not the luxury of the property, but whether it could provide a safe, stable environment for a child. He participated in lengthy interviews that explored his childhood, relationships, emotional health, and reasons for wanting to foster. Psychological evaluations asked him to revisit memories he had hidden for decades, forcing him to speak openly about experiences he had rarely shared with anyone. There were parenting classes, emergency preparedness requirements, medical clearances, character assessments, and stacks of paperwork that seemed to multiply every time another form was completed. Weeks became months. Months stretched even longer. Every time he believed he had reached the final step, another requirement appeared. The waiting tested his patience in ways no business negotiation ever had, because this wasn't a deal that could be accelerated through influence or determination. The process moved only as fast as the law allowed, and Fred respected that every delay existed to protect children like Christy. There were evenings when exhaustion nearly convinced him to stop. After another postponed hearing or another request for additional documentation, he would return home to a house that suddenly felt far larger and far quieter than it ever had before. He questioned whether everyone else had been right. Perhaps he had allowed one emotional afternoon to change the direction of his entire life. Perhaps Christy would eventually find another family, and he should step aside. One evening, while organizing old documents in his study, he opened a small storage box he hadn't touched in years. Inside lay a faded photograph from his childhood, taken during one of his earliest foster placements. Standing beside it was the only object he had kept from those years, a worn luggage tag that had once been tied to a black garbage bag carrying everything he owned. Fred picked it up carefully, running his fingers across the faded writing until memories flooded back with overwhelming force. He saw the frightened 8-year-old boy again, silently hoping someone would tell him he didn't have to leave anymore. In that moment, he realized something that changed everything. If he walked away now because the process was difficult, what message would that send to the child he used to be? The answer came almost immediately. That little boy had already been abandoned enough times. Fred refused to become another person who gave up. The following morning, his determination returned stronger than ever. Every form, every interview, every delay, and every difficult conversation became one more step toward a promise he hadn't yet spoken aloud but already carried in his heart. Somewhere across the city, Christy continued moving through life believing she was simply waiting for another temporary chapter. She had no idea that someone was fighting through months of obstacles for the chance to become part of her future. Neither of them knew exactly how the story would end. All they knew was that the waiting continued. Then, after months of preparation, interviews, inspections, paperwork, and uncertainty, the day finally arrived. The courtroom grew quiet as everyone took their seats. Fred looked toward the bench, his heart pounding with the same nervous anticipation he had felt as an 8-year-old waiting for adults to decide where he would live next. This time, however, the outcome carried a very different kind of hope. Finally, the judge made a decision. The courtroom was quieter than Fred expected. After months of paperwork, interviews, evaluations, home inspections, and waiting, the moment he had imagined countless times had finally arrived. Yet as he sat there, surrounded by legal documents and professionals who had carefully examined every part of his life, the importance of the moment had nothing to do with the billionaire sitting in the room. It had nothing to do with his companies, his achievements, or the fortune attached to his name. In that courtroom, Fred wasn't a businessman. He wasn't an investor. He wasn't the man whose decisions affected thousands of employees. He was simply someone who had made a promise to a little girl who once sat alone beneath a bus shelter carrying everything she owned in a garbage bag. Across the room sat Christy, quietly holding her notebook in her hands. The same notebook that had traveled with her from home to home. The same notebook filled with the names of families she had cared about but eventually had to leave behind. She looked calm on the outside, but anyone who knew her story understood how much courage it had taken for her to sit there. For years, courtrooms had represented decisions made about her future by adults she barely knew. This time felt different. This time, she wasn't waiting to hear where she would go next. She was waiting to discover whether she would finally have somewhere to stay. The judge reviewed the documents carefully before looking toward Fred and Christy. The room remained completely still as everyone waited for the decision. There were no dramatic speeches, no cameras, no celebration. Just a quiet moment carrying the weight of years of uncertainty. The judge spoke with the seriousness the moment deserved. explaining that the process had been completed and that Fred had demonstrated the commitment, stability, and dedication required to provide Christy with the permanent home she had spent years hoping for. Then the judge turned toward Christy. After everything she had experienced, after every move, every goodbye, and every temporary bedroom, one simple question was asked. Do you understand what today means? For many children, that question might have received an excited answer filled with dreams about new toys, vacations, or a bigger house. But Christy's response revealed something much deeper. She looked down for a moment, gathering the courage to say the words she had been waiting years to say. Then, quietly, almost as if she was afraid the moment might disappear if she spoke too loudly, she answered, I don't have to pack anymore. Those 5 words changed the entire room. For Fred, that sentence carried more emotion than any award, business achievement, or public recognition he had ever received. Because he understood exactly what Christy meant. She wasn't talking about clothes or boxes. She wasn't talking about moving from one bedroom to another. She was talking about finally feeling safe enough to believe tomorrow would look like today. She was talking about the freedom to unpack without fear. She was talking about waking up without wondering if another goodbye was coming. She was talking about belonging. Fred lowered his head as tears filled his eyes, and for a moment, the man who had negotiated billion-dollar decisions in front of powerful executives struggled to control his emotions. He wasn't crying because he felt sorry for Christy. He was crying because he knew what it meant for a child to spend years waiting for someone to choose them. He knew what it felt like to wonder whether you mattered enough for someone to stay. The courtroom became silent as everyone watching the moment understood that this was much bigger than a legal decision. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. After the hearing, Fred and Christy began building the ordinary moments that she had always wanted but rarely experienced. The things that seemed small to most people became priceless to her. For the first time, she had a bedroom that didn't feel temporary. A room where she could choose where to place her books. A place where she could hang pictures on the wall without wondering if she would need to remove them soon. A closet where she could organize her clothes instead of keeping them packed inside a bag. She received a backpack chosen specifically for her, not a replacement because something had been lost during another move, but something that belonged only to her. She had a birthday calendar hanging where she could see it every morning, marking celebrations she would no longer have to wonder whether anyone remembered. She had family photographs where she wasn't standing at the edge of the picture as a temporary guest, but where she was placed exactly where every child deserves to be, in the center of the family. And then came something that meant more than almost anything else. She had a last name she could carry proudly. Not because a name alone creates a family, but because it represented something Christy had spent years searching for. Permanence. The first night in her new home, Fred noticed something that broke his heart. Christy still kept a small portion of her belongings packed. Even though she had her own room, her own closet, and her own space, she had placed a few items inside the same black garbage bag she had carried to the bus stop. She wasn't doing it because she expected to leave. She was doing it because her mind had spent years preparing for that possibility. Fred didn't force her to unpack. He understood that trust cannot be demanded. It has to be built slowly through ordinary actions repeated over time. So instead of telling her she was staying, he showed her. He showed her through every breakfast, every school pickup, every conversation, and every promise he kept. Slowly, Christy began taking things out of the bag. A book went on the shelf. A picture went on the wall. Clothes went into drawers. Small pieces of her life moved from a place designed for temporary storage into a room that belonged to her. One afternoon, months after she moved in, Fred walked past her bedroom and noticed something that stopped him completely. The garbage bag was gone. In its place was a suitcase sitting neatly beside her closet. Not because she was preparing to leave, but because she finally had something she had never owned before. A proper place to keep the things that mattered. Fred stood there quietly, remembering the rainy afternoon when he first saw her beside that black garbage bag. He remembered the little boy he used to be. He remembered every time he had moved with his own belongings packed away, wondering if anyone would ever tell him he could stay. Now, decades later, he was watching another child experience something completely different. Christy wasn't carrying her life in something meant to be thrown away anymore. She was carrying it in something that represented dignity, possibility, and hope. But Fred soon realized that his journey with Christy was only the beginning. Because once he understood how many children were still facing the same reality she had faced, he couldn't simply return to his old life and pretend their stories didn't exist. The garbage bag that brought them together was never just about one child. It represented thousands of children who deserved better. And as Fred would soon discover, giving Christy a permanent home would become the first step toward a mission far greater than either of them ever imagined. Many people who heard Fred and Christy's story believed that the courtroom was where the journey ended. They imagined the final chapter was simple. A billionaire met a child in need, he opened his heart, and a little girl finally found a family. It was the kind of ending that felt complete. The kind of story people share because it reminds them that kindness still exists in a world that often feels disconnected. But for Fred, the courtroom decision wasn't the end. It was the moment everything became impossible to ignore. Because after Christy moved into her new home, after she began experiencing the stability she had always hoped for, Fred found himself thinking about the thousands of children who were still sitting in bus stations, offices, and temporary placements carrying the same black garbage bags that had changed his life. He couldn't forget the conversations he had with social workers. He couldn't forget the stories he read from former foster children. He couldn't forget how many children entered new homes carrying everything they owned in something designed to be thrown away. The more he learned, the clearer one truth became. Christy's experience wasn't unusual. It was simply one story among thousands. The garbage bag wasn't only a symbol of her childhood. It represented a much larger problem that had existed quietly for years. Children who had already experienced the pain of losing their homes were being reminded, in the smallest but most powerful ways, that their belongings were temporary and their place in the world felt uncertain. Fred began asking a question that would eventually change the direction of his work. If one garbage bag could affect him so deeply, how many children had carried the same thing without anyone stopping to ask why? He understood that replacing a bag with a suitcase would not solve every challenge within the foster care system. A suitcase couldn't erase trauma. It couldn't replace a parent. It couldn't undo years of uncertainty. But Fred also understood something important. Sometimes meaningful change begins with a simple message. Sometimes the smallest gestures communicate the things people need to hear most. For a child entering foster care, a suitcase wasn't just a container for clothes. It was a statement. It said, "Your belongings matter." It said, "You deserve dignity." It said, "Someone thought about you before you arrived." Those words might seem simple to adults, but to a child who has spent years feeling forgotten, they can mean everything. Fred decided that no child should begin another chapter of life carrying their possessions in something that made them feel disposable. Using his resources, Fred created a national initiative designed to provide foster children with something many people take for granted, a proper way to carry their lives. The program focused on delivering personalized care packages to children entering foster care across the country. Each child received a durable suitcase, a backpack for school, a comfortable blanket, a journal where they could record their thoughts and memories, and personal care items chosen specifically to remind them that someone had considered their needs. The goal wasn't to create expensive gifts or generate attention. The goal was to restore something that many children in the system had quietly lost: a sense of worth. Fred wanted every child opening one of these packages to understand that their circumstances did not define their value. Their past did not determine their future. They were not problems to be moved around. They were children deserving of care, respect, and hope. The initiative quickly expanded beyond Fred's original expectations. Foster care organizations, social workers, and volunteers across different states began joining the effort. People who had spent years advocating for children in the system saw something powerful in the message behind the program. It wasn't simply about luggage. It was about changing the first impression a child received when entering a new environment. Instead of arriving with a plastic bag that carried the painful reminder of everything they had lost, they arrived with something created specifically for them. a suitcase with their name attached to it, a backpack they could take to school without feeling different, a journal where their story could exist in their own words, a blanket that belonged only to them. Small items, but powerful reminders that someone saw them. As Fred visited different foster care communities, he noticed something that stayed with him. The children weren't focused on the cost of the items. They weren't impressed because a wealthy businessman had provided them. What mattered was the feeling behind the gesture. Many children had spent years believing they were temporary. The suitcase quietly challenged that belief. It told them that even if their situation was changing, their identity remained important. It told them that they weren't being moved like objects from one location to another. They were people with dreams, personalities, fears, and futures. One social worker later explained that the reaction from children was often emotional because many of them had never received something that was truly theirs from the beginning of a transition. They weren't receiving leftovers. They weren't receiving something someone no longer needed. They were receiving something chosen specifically for them. For Fred, every suitcase delivered brought him back to the rainy afternoon when he first saw Christy sitting beside that garbage bag. He remembered the question he asked the social worker. Is anyone waiting for her? The answer had been no. But through this initiative, he hoped fewer children would ever feel that way again. He wanted every child entering foster care to know that someone was waiting. Someone cared. Someone believed they deserved more than simply surviving another move. The program became a reminder that compassion doesn't always begin with solving the largest problems immediately. Sometimes it begins by recognizing the small moments where dignity has been missing and deciding that those moments matter. Years earlier, Fred had believed his greatest achievement was building companies worth billions of dollars. He thought success was measured through numbers, investments, and accomplishments that could be displayed publicly. But after meeting Christy, his definition of success completely changed. The most meaningful thing he ever created wasn't a company. It wasn't a financial empire. It was a bridge between a child who felt forgotten and a future where she could finally believe she belonged. And the most important lesson he learned came from something incredibly simple. The suitcase wasn't expensive, but it told every child something priceless. Your life isn't trash. Your story matters. You matter. Almost a year after the rainy afternoon that changed everything, Fred returned to the place where the story began. The same bus stop stood quietly beside the road. The same streets carried the same endless stream of passing cars. The same city continued moving at a pace that rarely allowed people to notice the moments happening around them. But everything about that place felt different now because Fred was no longer seeing it through the eyes of a billionaire who had everything. He was seeing it through the eyes of the child he used to be and the little girl who had reminded him of a truth he had spent decades forgetting. He remembered the 11-year-old girl sitting alone, holding onto a black garbage bag because it was the only thing she had to carry her belongings. He remembered the fear in her eyes, the quiet acceptance in her voice, and the way she had learned to expect another goodbye before she had even arrived somewhere new. That moment had changed the direction of his life forever. But now, standing in that same place, Fred saw something completely different. He saw another child walking toward the bus stop, but this time there was no garbage bag beside her. In her hand was a bright blue suitcase. The little girl walked with confidence, not because her life was perfect, not because every challenge had suddenly disappeared, but because someone had given her something every child deserves before they ever enter a difficult chapter of life, the feeling that they matter. The suitcase rolling beside her wasn't a symbol of wealth or luxury. It wasn't expensive because of the materials used to make it. Its true value came from what it represented. It represented dignity. It represented care. It represented a simple message that every child entering foster care deserves to hear. You are not forgotten. You are not invisible. You are not disposable. Fred watched as the child adjusted the handle of the suitcase and waited for the bus. And for a moment, the years between his childhood and that rainy afternoon seemed to disappear. He could almost see the young boy he once was standing in the same place, holding a garbage bag, hoping someone would notice. And then he understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Fred thought he was rescuing Christy. He believed he was the person who stepped into her story at the exact moment she needed someone. He believed he was giving her something she had never experienced before, a permanent home, a family, and a future filled with possibilities. But as the years passed, he realized something far more powerful. Christy had rescued him. She had rescued the little boy he had spent 40 years trying to forget. The little boy who believed he had to become successful before he could finally feel safe. The little boy who thought money could replace what he lost. The little boy who carried painful memories behind every achievement and never allowed himself to admit how much he still needed healing. Meeting Christy forced Fred to look back at the part of himself he had abandoned. It reminded him that the child he once was deserved compassion too. And by helping Christy find a home, he finally gave himself permission to stop running from his own past. The truth is, some children don't need miracles. They don't need someone to completely change the world overnight. They need something much simpler and much more powerful. They need someone who notices, someone who listens, someone who refuses to look away when everyone else keeps walking. Because sometimes the greatest impact a person can make begins with a single moment of compassion. A conversation, a question, a decision to stop when everyone else continues moving. Fred could have driven past that bus stop like hundreds of other people did that afternoon. He could have convinced himself that someone else would help. He could have looked at Christy's situation as someone else's responsibility. But he didn't. He stopped. And because he stopped, one child's future changed. Then thousands of other children received a reminder that they were worthy of being cared for. The most valuable thing Fred ever gave Christy wasn't money. It wasn't a house. It wasn't access to opportunities most people could only dream about. The greatest gift he gave her was something every child deserves, but not every child receives. Permanence. The feeling of knowing that tomorrow would not begin with another goodbye. The comfort of waking up in the same room, seeing familiar faces, and knowing that she didn't have to keep preparing herself to leave. For a child who had spent years carrying her life in a garbage bag, permanence was the greatest luxury of all. And perhaps that is the question this story leaves behind. How many children are still waiting for someone to notice them? How many young people are carrying invisible burdens because the world has become too busy to stop and look closer? Fred's story reminds us that compassion doesn't always arrive through grand gestures. Sometimes it begins with simply seeing another person and deciding they matter. So let us know in the comments below. If you had walked past that bus stop and saw Christy sitting there alone with a garbage bag beside her, would you have stopped? Do you believe every child deserves to carry hope instead of a garbage bag? We would love to hear your thoughts, and we read every comment. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories of resilience, compassion, and extraordinary acts of kindness. And before you leave, tell us where you are watching from. We would love to know how far this story has traveled and who is sharing this moment with us today.